character, but, how can Jesus command love like a director go? Really can't. Or can he?
Well, because love is more than an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Has to be.
Love is also an attitude and an action.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a whole chapter of this in our book. But to understand love and to obey the command of Jesus for us to love each other, we've got to understand that love is an emotion, but it's also an attitude and an action.
And for my snarky listeners who are out there, what does this mean if love is an emotion, an attitude, and an action? Friends, you can love your mother-in-law. I'm just putting that down.
I don't know where to go with that, so let's just...
So I think that we can talk about great examples of love in the Bible.
You may be one choice away from a thriving marriage. Welcome to the Operation Thriving Marriage podcast with Brian and Jennifer Harvey.
So in our theme of, if you listen to the last episode, Jen was talking about how this microphone in front of her face while we're doing this podcast, she's constantly thinking of songs. And so this podcast releasing around Valentine's Day, which we're entitling What is Love? And now Jen has like 80 songs going through her head right now that she's going to start singing.
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's just, be glad you got Brian here and Todd, our producer, or else, you'd have to cover your ears for all of these songs that are kind of flowing through my head.
I have heard Jen sing, and she actually has a beautiful voice.
Oh,
so
you're
don't
kind.
put up with any of that trash from her.
Oh, okay. Well, here we are. But yeah, there's all kinds of things going through my head. As everybody here knows, I love my 1980s music and things. But just on that theme of love, I mean, the Foreigners rock anthem. I want to know what love is, right? There's that "Baby Don't Hurt Me" song. So I think we're thinking Saturday Night Live version from the 1980s. Kind of twitching your head to the side, and that's taking place in a nightclub, and it's just kind of a riot there.
And Todd and I did notice, by the way, that you skipped the first song that was the country song "Love Ain't" by the Eli Young Band.
Because I don't consider that to be a song, because it's country music, and
It's
I don't
fantastic.
consider country music to be like a legit music genre. So
But you love Dolly, and as Todd pointed out,
my
since
goodness,
you love Dolly,
yes. How do
you
everybody should love
country
Dolly
music,
Parton.
so-
Oh my goodness, absolutely. So
you heard it here. So Jen professes that she hates country music, but really she secretly loves it. You've all heard it now.
Oh, okay, that's taking things out of context, but I will say I love Dolly Parton, now and forever. But in any event here, I think it's important to kind of talk through, guys, what is love really? So we use that word a lot. Again, I will say I love Dolly Parton, right? I just think that she just has such a big ... heart, right? She's just a really great human being, very humanitarian oriented. How could you not love her? But of course, we use that for a lot of things. I'll say I love Brian, I love my kids, I love traveling, I love my friends. You love pizza. We love traveling for different OTM live events, especially in the wintertime if we're going south, right? Or going west for that. But you use that in a lot of different contexts there. So I think really that crux of what is love, as I'm twitching my head because of the SNL kind of version of "Baby Don't Hurt Me," what is it?
What's really tricky, and it's important for us, obviously, love is talked about so much in the context of marriage, and Jesus commands us to love. So Mark 12:28, and one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he, Jesus, had answered them well, asked him, "Which commandment is the most important of all?" And Jesus answered, "The most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. There is no other commandment greater than these. Jesus commands us to love. And if we're commanded to love, then it has to be something more than merely emotion. Emotion, we don't control that. Emotion is, we talked about this recently, emotion is a response to a stimulus. We can't control that, yet we're commanded to love. So love has to be more than an emotion.
Right, and similarly, in John 13:34 and 35, Jesus says, "That's that new commandment I give to you, and that is to love one another. Just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. By this all people will know you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So it's not just in Mark. Jesus has said this more than once. And with that being more than just an emotion that you're feeling, you can think about some ways where you might be triggered by this. I know the example that you've used over years, Brian, has been a haunted house. If you get some jump scare, some dummy jumps out and startles you, what happens to your body with that, within that limbic system, and these chemicals going into your bloodstream. It's like your muscles tense, your pupils dilated, your heart rate increased. You may have like literally jumped at a jump scare. You might have screamed. I know, Brian, you've said that you've said this like since we started dating, when we were like, late teenagers, just saying, I don't go to haunted houses because I'm afraid something's going to jump out, and not that I'm going to be afraid of it, I'm going to punch it.
Well, no, I'm afraid, and I'm attacking the thing I'm afraid of.
Okay, there you
And
go.
That actually might have one time happened.
I think statute of limitations has passed for that, but moving on. Anyway, a few minutes later or a few seconds later, your brain would process the data for the haunted house. You'd realize you were safe, and then the fear is gone and just kind of moving on there, right? But we do have that kind of limited control over those emotions that we have. So if we have such a limited control over our emotions, how would Christ then be able to command us to love? There are actors, of course, who can practically on command start to cry or bring out these display of emotions, even though it's not theirs, they're in their character. But, how can Jesus command love like a director? Go. Really can't. Or can he?
Well, because love is more than an emotion.
Mm-hmm. Has to be.
Love is also an attitude and an action.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a whole chapter of this in our book. But to understand love and to obey the command of Jesus for us to love each other, we've got to understand that love is an emotion, but it's also an attitude and an action.
And for my snarky listeners who are out there, what does this mean if love is an emotion, an attitude, and an action? Friends, you can love your mother-in-law. I'm just putting that down.
I don't know where to go with that, so let's just...
So I think that we can talk about great examples of love in the Bible. Relationship between David and Jonathan, best friends there until the end. And if you have your Bible and you want to open this up, you can kind of take a look through their story, because that's in 1 Samuel 18 and 20. So again, who are these guys? They're best friends, or they become best friends. Jonathan is the crown prince, successor to the throne of Israel. He's the son of King Saul, and David is David. I'm talking about David, who becomes the king. He defeated Goliath the giant with that slingshot. But when we first meet him, he's the youngest son of a shepherd from the town of Bethlehem. And unfortunately, after David's brought in and thought of very well by Saul, who is the king at the time, Saul ends up rejecting David because he's not happy that Saul himself was rejected by God as the king of Israel.
Well, let's back up a little bit before that, though. So you've got David and Jonathan. One of the things when they first meet in chapter 18, in 1 Samuel chapter 18, we see that as soon as David, had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Okay, so in this sense, it's not this emotion of this feeling of love, but rather it's this attitude. Now, there are some people that will do some weird things with David and Jonathan, but when you look at the text and when you look at the words that are used in the Bible, this is an attitude saying that Jonathan wanted what was best for David. That attitude, and that's what love is first after emotion. That attitude of love that Jesus commands us is to desire that which is good of another person.
Mm-hmm.
And so then in your marriage, you have those romantic feelings of love, But those ebb and flow because your emotions ebb and flow based on stimulus. As much as you love your husband or wife, that romantic feeling is not always at its peak. You don't love your husband or wife in this moment, probably the same way, unless you're on your honeymoon listening to this podcast. You don't love them the same way you did that romance of the honeymoon. That environment, that experience created something that was a different place where you felt those emotions. But you can always have this attitude towards your spouse or towards people of, I want what is best for you, whatever that best thing is. Love is also, you've got this attitude. You can see Jonathan had this attitude of love towards David, but you can also see later on in the story how Jonathan's actions were loving towards David.
Well, I think some of this is we know that Saul wanted to strike down David and kill him because he felt very threatened by him. Of course, in their story, we have the crowds of the Israelites singing, "Saul has struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands," and that saying really displeased him because he felt like he was being undercut as the king. And that very next day, Saul tried to kill David twice. And then over the next chapter, Saul devises some different schemes to try to kill him, and even putting him through different tests and things like that. And at this point in time, David will go to his friend, Saul's son Jonathan, for help, and says, "Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there's guilt in me, kill me yourself. For why should you bring me to your father?" And Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, why would I not tell you?" And then we'll skip down some verses to 13. "But should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more so also if I do not disclose it to you and send you away that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father." And we do see there that Jonathan had that attitude of love towards David. He was believing the best in David. He wanted the best for David. And of course, we know that emotion is based largely on those contexts. And Brian, as you said earlier in this podcast, we always have that limited control of how we feel, but that's never true when it comes to our attitudes. The attitudes that we have towards each other as spouses, towards folks in the workplace and friends and people in our community, that attitude is always within our own control.
Right. And so, I mean, an example of this I love is when my son or our son used to play baseball. One of the things that the coach would always do at the end of every game was he would have the team rate their attitude at the end of the game. It was a thumbs up or a thumbs down. How was your attitude during the game? Because that's something, and he would tell them, look, we can practice hard, we can play well, we can play our best game, and if we play our best baseball and make no mistakes, we could still go up against a team that's better than us. They just play better. Not that, and we couldn't have done anything different. We played our absolute best, but we can't control whether we win or lose.
Absolutely. And Jesus is able to command us to love our enemies even because it's not how we feel about them. Instead, it's our attitude that we would have through them. Jesus commands us to love each other just as he loved us. And he so is then commanding us to have that attitude of love towards each other. So love is that emotion, love is that attitude, and love is also that action. And if we're talking more about Jonathan and David decide to put together a plan for Jonathan to test if Saul really had it in for David. And what ends up happening is Saul is so angry and I think blinded with rage. And he says to Jonathan, calling his son names here, "Do you know that you have chosen the son of Jesse, being David, to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he will surely die." But Jonathan understanding that he's the crown prince of Israel and would be losing out by David continuing to live in that respect, just loved David so much and had that attitude of love and care for him that he didn't want David to be killed. Instead, he had just went back and challenged his father and said, why should David be put to death? What has he done? And Saul, again, blinded with rage, in my opinion, breaks and has an emotional break, again, in my opinion, and hurls his spear at Jonathan to strike him. So almost kills his own son, who's the crown prince. Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death, and Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food the second day of the month, for he was so grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. And again, that's 1 Samuel 20. But wow, I mean, what a confrontation.
Yeah, so Jonathan there, Jonathan didn't just want what was best for David, he took action.
Oh,
he
at a cost.
Did something about it.
At a big cost to himself.
He didn't just check, hey, Dad, are you mad at David? No, he stood up for David in front of his father, risking his own life.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing. Jonathan didn't do something easy. Jonathan didn't love David only when it was convenient. Jonathan didn't only love David when David was doing what Jonathan wanted him to do. Jonathan didn't only love David when it felt good. Husbands and wives, we can't just love our spouses when it's convenient.
Oh, sure. And if you're one with your spouse, everything you're doing is affecting your spouse and vice versa. And that marriage relationship is elevated above a friendship. So, seeing this lived out in Jonathan and David, so much more should this be applying to a marriage. Being able to love your spouse, even if there's great personal risk to you. And what about Jesus? How did he show his love for us? Well, of course, the cross. And what did he say in John? Just as I have loved you, so you are to love one another.
So I guess as you're listening to this podcast and think about this, when you say you love your spouse, what do you mean? Do you mean you feel a certain way towards your spouse? I hope so.
Is it just warm and fuzzy and fondness?
Yeah. But I hope you have those positive romantic feelings about your spouse. They ebb and flow. They will. You're not going to have the same romantic, the same sexual passion in every moment of your marriage. But I hope you have feelings. But what about your attitude towards your spouse?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we talk about this like, well, self-referential part is like, hey, wanting what's best for your spouse is wanting what's best for you because you're one because of the marriage. But do you want what's best for your spouse because you love them and have that attitude of love?
Right.
And
you also, are you having those feelings of, my spouse has goodwill towards me, and I have goodwill for my spouse, so that my spouse isn't trying to sabotage me. My spouse isn't out to get me. Do you have that kind of attitude towards your spouse as well?
And then what actions? When you say, I love my husband, I love my wife, what actions are you taking? Because first of all, it's self-evident when you're married, you are sacrificing of yourself. You're giving up your desires, your wants. You're giving up something of yourself when you're married. That's just true, and no one disputes that or argues that at all. But how far are you willing to take that in your actions? What are you willing to sacrifice? Because, well, to be honest, we've encountered couples where the husband or the wife is only going to sacrifice up to a point, and it's to a point of convenience.
Right. We've talked about there are convenient ways to love, but I really believe that when you're doing ministry, and I think that to an extent, being in a marriage, serving the other is part of a ministry as well that you have as being one, as growing in your marriage, becoming more Christ-like. And there are convenient things that you can do to love, and there are these inconvenient things. And I do think that love and ministry, it's always going to be inconvenient if you're really doing it right, and it's always going to cost you something.
Absolutely. But the great thing about this is this is a self-generating cycle, because your attitudes and your actions affect your emotions. When kids have a good attitude playing a game, they can have fun even if they lose. And then the game is more fun because their attitude is affecting their emotions. If you have a loving attitude towards someone over time, you're going to start feeling love towards them. So as that emotion, the romance ebbs and flows, the more you think about the attitude you have towards your spouse that you can control, the more loving emotions you will have for your spouse 10, 20, 30 years into your marriage, where you can say, I love my husband, I love my wife more today than I did the moment we were married. And that's not something magical that just over time you hope it happens. We all see those older couples, and they have just this wonderful relationship. You see them look each other in the eyes, and they have this obvious love for each other. And that's because they maintain that attitude towards each other, and that attitude has affected their emotions. So they feel more loving because they have an attitude of love towards their spouse.
And that love just keeps growing, and it's just beautiful. And your actions, of course, affect your emotions. When you do these loving things for someone, you'll start to feel loving feelings towards them. So yeah, Brian was just saying, oh, I don't know what to do that if you're saying, yes, you can love your mother-in-law, right? So serving your family, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, that really annoying person you can't avoid. I'm not saying that's your mother-in-law. It could be, I don't know. That's up to you listeners to know and
Mother-in-laws
understand.
get such a bad rap on this podcast.
Stepmothers do, I think, in pop culture. Stepmothers, I think, can be heroes.
Yes.
I think mother-in-laws can be heroes, but that's another thing. But all of just these actions, acting on these your attitudes, doing these things, will play into those emotions, and hopefully that's growing stronger relationships, specifically within your marriage, but with other relationships that you have. Do these actions of kingdom living, and then start to feel that kind of love.
Love is an emotion. Love is also attitude and action. We strongly believe you love your spouse, but we also know that sometimes it's hard to love each other. And we want to encourage you, as we're around Valentine's Day when this episode is dropping, to think not just how you feel about your spouse, which you can't control, but about your attitude. Do you have an attitude that you want what's best for your spouse no matter what? And you're willing to sacrifice beyond the level of convenience for your spouse. And when you do that, your emotion, your experience of love will grow, and your marriage will grow into the thriving marriage that God wants for you. Thank you for listening. We encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Please rate and subscribe, and that helps the word get out of our podcast. Thank you so much.
Jen and I started Operation Thriving Marriage to help couples and churches take marriages from merely surviving to thriving. We've got our book, we've got a blog, and resources for our coaching ministry, and you can bring us out for an Operation Thriving Marriage experience. For more information, go to OperationThrivingMarriage.com. That's OperationThrivingMarriage.com.